last week, so make sure you don't forget about the quizzes. But other than that, we have just the final exam to get through in this class. Again, like exam 2, the final exam is just from today until the end of the semester. It's not a cumulative over everything we've talked about. It's today until the end. So again, another opportunity if you're like, wow, two tests in a row that didn't go so hot. Today's a new day. Pay better attention, take better notes, come to class, come to office hours. You can ace the final exam, which you can see is like 1% worth 1% more than the other two exams. So still significant and even has a little bit more weight to it than exams 1 and 2. But again, today is the start of the final unit. We'll work through, as we can see, we're starting with the Enlightenment and we'll end with the fall of Napoleon, and then we'll send you off to Hume 3 someday. Okay, so today we are kind of bridging the scientific revolution and essentially how it morphs from there into what's oftentimes viewed as a different but related movement during this time. So as you'll see, I'll try to make the case that without the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment probably couldn't or wouldn't have happened. But scholars usually put this into a different category than the scientific revolution. And so we call that the Enlightenment. Again, during their time, they did not say, oh, isn't it great that we're living in the midst of the Enlightenment, right? They didn't know that they were living in this period necessarily. This is a term that comes from the modern world. And again, it contrasts with the Dark Ages. This is like, again, 1800s Europeans saying, wow, we're so enlightened now. Do you remember what it was like in those superstitious Middle Ages? And those became the Dark Ages in comparison to the so-called Enlightenment, right? We are so enlightened now at this point. But again, that comes more in the 1800s, looking back on this period. So we have to kind of think again at the beginning of all of this, then what is the Enlightenment? Again, like all of our periods, this overlaps with things happening simultaneously. Some scholars push the Enlightenment all the way back to beginning at the, essentially the end of the 30 Years' War. Again, maybe the 30 Years' War brackets the Reformation. Says those days are now over. You have to accept some version of toleration. And so maybe the Enlightenment really begins there. Some scholars push it a little bit later, a little bit earlier. So we'll just give it a nice round number of 1650. Bless you. And then ending with the fall of Napoleon. So that's what the 1815 there is associated with. Again, that will be the end of our class's chronology after Napoleon rises, tries to take over all of Europe, and then fails. And so 1815 oftentimes, in many ways, becomes the dawn of the modern age, the age that you and I currently live in. Revolutions are over. Nobody's really trying to be an emperor anymore, supposedly, in 1815. And so that kind of brackets our class and brackets the Enlightenment as the modern world has been ushered in. So dates-wise, again, just to make it easy, 1650 to 1815. Like the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment is an intellectual movement. An intellectual movement. However, it's not monolithic. Right, again, this is one of the things that even what we saw with the Reformation, we oftentimes, again, I've done this a million times in this class, the Renaissance, the Reformation, the scientific revolution. And it makes it seem like everyone's on the same page, they all know where they're going, they all have the same ideas about what life should be and what progress means. The Enlightenment's the same way. It is a movement, but it's by no means we all decided this is where we're going, this is what we're doing. So that's what I mean by it not being monolithic. People are competing, bless you, with essentially how life should be lived in a post-scientific revolution world, in a post-Reformation world, in the midst of absolutist monarchs. People are competing with it. Essentially, what should life be like? So it's not monolithic, and we'll try to see that, some of the competing arguments, again, similarly to what we saw in the scientific revolution, right? They all want to understand the cosmos, but they disagreed on what the data illustrated. Right? Same thing here, but more from a sort of philosophical and political side. I don't think we can downplay the influence of the scientific revolution on the Enlightenment, though. Again, even though they're considered two different movements, one of the big things that influences, or I should say it differently, I'll put it this way, two big influences from the scientific revolution that carry over into the Enlightenment are Bacon and Descartes. Their views, essentially, on how to come up with information, right? What things are true and how do you get there? How can we even know something at all? Heavily influences the Enlightenment. And again, both of those people still influence the modern natural sciences and modern philosophy with the way that they believe things can be known. So those things are coming in, especially Bacon and Descartes' understandings of inductive and deductive reasoning. And then again, philosophers using that same method, or those same methods, are essentially critiquing different aspects that they have inherited from the Middle Ages and from the Renaissance. So again, as we've seen, everything's being critiqued. The Catholic Church is critiqued, and that results in the Reformation. Aristotle and Ptolemy are critiqued, and that results in the scientific revolution. Now we're going to get some more critiques of the old world that result in essentially the modern world that you and I inherit. One of the things, again, that you and I inherit that is, again, somewhat taken for granted is that now in the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, you're actually getting an intellectual society that is developing in Europe. Again, universities at this point have been around, right, for a few hundred years, but the culture of the university is going to spread into the everyday life in a more substantial way in the Enlightenment. So that's what we mean here by an intellectual society. It's not just, oh, there's the university, there's the schools over there, and that's where all the academics take place. Now some of that spreads to the everyday world of people, okay, as Europe's culture and society changes. So for instance, again, everything's taking place in the university, so of course we'll start there. Again, in England, Oxford and Cambridge are still essentially the only two universities that you can go to, but it's starting to grow in the United Kingdom more. Obviously, universities continue to proliferate in Europe, so we'll start with the universities, but then intellectual communities start to develop, they sort of overflow out of that, and you start to see things that, again, people like me simply take for granted as a part of what it means to be an academic. So essentially, things that used to be from the Middle Ages that, again, we talked about weeks and weeks ago, like guilds, right? This idea that people who are in the same industry can come together and share their power and have a lot of leverage. Some of that starts to happen in the academic world as well, as a way, again, to kind of test each other's ideas. So if a scientist wants to promote a new idea, they will publish it, and then academic societies will be there to critique it and essentially say, no, the data doesn't follow what you're saying here. Or how can you come to that conclusion based upon this data? Again, this is stuff that we now take for granted. Many of you participate in this, right? Whether you're doing research with a faculty member or many of you have presented papers or posters at academic societies. This is where that idea begins. You publish things so that people can read it and critique it. And then as a group, you come to sort of a shared knowledge. I'm a part of all sorts of random academic societies that some of them I participate in more than others. And so I inherit this for sure in my job. Present a paper, get critiqued, change it, try to get it published, talk to more people about it. But it's overflowing from just my university now into essentially a society of people that have come together across Europe. And then it overflows even more from there into what are called journals. So in the European world of the Enlightenment, you would actually publish this, and people could buy it. Academics could buy it, or just the everyday person. You might just simply have a rich person who can afford to purchase reading material, and he or she may be interested in the new scientific advancements. And so they can go and purchase that journal and actually read what you argue, even though they are, a farmer or a merchant or a business person. So they may not actually even be in academia, but can now read and interact with your ideas. And so these scholars would publish this, and it would become more public than it used to be in the past. And then the place where everyday people could do this if they were of a certain level, right? Again, you have to always understand that there's a lower class of people who are living in poverty who wouldn't have the time and resources to do this. But if you did, one thing that became common across Europe is that you would actually go to a coffee house. And at that coffee house, literally, right, you go down to the Starbucks and discuss the issues of the day with other peers. Coffee, which had pretty much been unheard of before colonialism, has now become somewhat of a middle class to upper class staple in Europe in the Enlightenment. And people would go to coffee houses and discuss these issues substantially. So actually, let me go back to my title slide here today. There it is. Underneath, you can see underneath the title, that is a depiction of an early modern coffee house. All right, so you can see all these people in their high class garb there, so you can understand that they're not living in poverty based upon what they're wearing and the level to which they're wearing it. And you can see the nice little barista up over here. Right, she's getting the coffee prepared, and then you see all these people seated, again, drinking coffee. You can see their journals, right? You can see the little journal there. There's a coffee cup. And they're discussing the great issues of the day while sipping coffee or tea. And so the world of the university literally, this is everything I just did, right? Literally is overflowing into the everyday life of at least middle to upper class people. What used to just be the domain of the church is now the domain of the university, but now the university's academic life is overflowing into other societies, to journals, and then into the lives of everyday people who are discussing these discoveries amongst themselves. So in many ways, the Enlightenment is kind of a shift of culture towards the academic in kind of the everyday world. Again, maybe something more akin to what we do today, right, where we can discuss ideas because they come to us so quickly, that we can actually discuss the news quickly. We can discuss changes, whether they're economic or military changes, quickly. A version of that is happening with the academic life in Europe as discoveries move beyond the university and into the everyday world. Now, there's a key part of the Enlightenment that, again, seems almost obvious but needs to be made very clear. And that is, in the Enlightenment, one of the things that makes this a different movement than the scientific revolution, although, again, you can see they're very closely related. But philosophically, in the Enlightenment, the thing that they cared about most was reason. And what I mean by that is rationality. In the Enlightenment, they wanted to subject everything to reason. Right. So again, maybe another way to put it here is, and again, this is from many of the people living during the time of the Enlightenment, is, quote, the supreme confidence in the rational mind. And I do want to emphasize that first part, supreme confidence. The Enlightenment, in many ways, just assumed that if you used your mind and put anything to scrutiny using your mind, you will come to the clear, right conclusion. And then maybe we're arguing about the nuances of it, but the idea of superstition, the idea of even tradition, particularly when it comes to the church, and I'll say this more in a little bit, those things need to all be put under the domain of the rational mind. What can we know and think about and understand by what our mind can conceive? So in many ways, again, I would actually argue that the Enlightenment is essentially the bringing together, I put the word summation here, but essentially where the scientific revolution was always going to lead naturally. When the scientific revolution continued to overturn inherited authorities, when the scientific revolution continued to subject tradition and the church to data that could be rationally organized and understood, that the Enlightenment was naturally going to move to the next step. It wasn't just going to be about the observable universe, but now the deeper aspects of life as well. Go ahead, Dean. Yeah, that the scientific revolution was going to essentially move beyond just what we can know about the universe and now go to the deeper aspects of what we can know about life itself. And again, I'll put some categories up here in just a second. So honestly, I don't know how you feel, but in many ways, the Enlightenment feels like the way what modern Westerners in some ways think about our world. It kind of have this idea in the Enlightenment of, look how far we've come in such a short period of time. We used to believe, in Aristotle and Ptolemy in a perfect cylindrical universe, that the earth was at the center, but now look how far we've come in such a short period of time. If you put the mind to the task, we can make humongous progress in a short period of time. So in many ways, it has a very optimistic view of where humans are going, especially in such a short period of time. All right, and again, this is why later people in the 18th century will call this period the Enlightenment. It's going from the darkness of the Middle Ages to the Enlightenment, right? Literally, things are being shed light on. Where we used to be in darkness, now we're in the light. So it has I don't know if we'd call that kind of an arrogant view of what's happening, or just a very confident view of what's happening. Maybe I'll use that word. It's just they're very confident in the way the direction of life is moving in this period. And to be honest, they have some good points to make, as we'll see throughout today's class. But again, one of the big things that's different between the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment is which authorities are being questioned in the Enlightenment. Obviously, the scientific revolution, since we talked about it, questions a lot of authorities, but they were scientific authorities, right? The world of natural philosophy. Here, and again, you can kind of see it in this, this is like a curriculum board over here on the right-hand side from the Enlightenment. But it's going to critique traditional views of, for instance, morality. Right? All throughout, since Rome became Christian, the West has presupposed Christian morals. Now in the Enlightenment, it's going to question those inherited moral traditions. Is the way that the Christian church argued for the correct way according to reason. You can't just assume it is, so you have to subject the morality of the church to reason as well. It's going to question the nature of humanity. Again, from a Christian perspective in the Middle Ages, the assumption was humans, because of sin, are naturally evil, or naturally prone to do sinful actions. And the Enlightenment will put that to scrutiny. Are we really born evil? Or is there a different aspect of human nature that's more positive or more optimistic, at least, to put it in that way? Maybe we're not born evil. Maybe evil is taught to us. And so goodness can also be taught to us. And so human nature is more of like a blank slate in which you are taught goodness or evil. We talked about this a little bit with Hobbes kind of ending out the scientific revolution, but political philosophies will come under significant scrutiny during the Enlightenment. England will continue to become more of a democracy during this period. France is going to be the one in which all of this blows up on. It kind of inherits all of this in the worst possible way with the French Revolution, where we'll end the class. But essentially, more or less, I would say, the American Revolution is an Enlightenment concept to a degree. Right, when you mix in the political philosophies that are coming with the idea of what a king or what a government should or should not do, or should not be, that the American Revolution in many ways is an Enlightenment concept. Not totally, but to a degree, it's influenced particularly people like Thomas Jefferson, for sure, an enlightened thinker, an Enlightenment thinker. And then, of course, underneath all of that is religion. Religion comes under significant scrutiny, and obviously because we're in the West, in particular, Christianity. Western thinkers will critique Judaism and Islam as well, but that's kind of, on the periphery. They are critiquing really assumed traditions of Christianity. And so some new versions of religion will actually come out of this movement as well. So in many ways, this is why scholars try to give a break, even though, of course, it can never be a perfect break, between the scientific revolution, right, which is revolutionizing bodies of knowledge, and the Enlightenment, which is revolutionizing sort of worldviews, how people understand the world to work on a deeper idea level, not just, according to mathematics, but literally, how should our societies function? What is the most rational way a society can function? Does that make sense? So that's why we usually give it two separate things, although again, as we've seen, all these things are interrelated. Right? You can never really separate what happened in the Reformation with then the splintering of science and the splintering of society and vice versa. Right? Okay, then let's examine a few ways that society changed underneath all of this. Like, what is actually happening in Europe that's changing? Let me see this. One of the biggest things that's going to bring about the Enlightenment from a cultural side, not just what's happening in the universities, but what things have changed in the everyday world. One is that the populations of Europe actually started to go up. And there's a few reasons for this. One of the reasons is agricultural growth. So again, this is interrelated to population growth. So during this time, again, just to kind of give broad statistics, because it's always hard before censuses become really standardized. Europe's population may have gone up by 1/3 in this 150-year period. And that's really substantial. Right? The amount of people going up 30% in 150 years is pretty significant. One of the reasons for that is that agriculture actually got better. Right? People in this time are still farmers. Again, that's not going to change until Hume 3, when you discuss the Industrial Revolution. Some of those changes are beginning, but they're just starting to change in a small way. And so most people are still reliant on farming and the food that farming produces. And so agriculture actually started to get better. People started to innovate in terms of farming again. particularly when it came to crops that could do better, and again, in terms of weather. They started doing things like, this is kind of obscure farming stuff, but when they were plowing a field, which is when you dig out rows, they used to just do like sort of parallel rows, just straight up. They started doing checkered rows, so that now you had more room to plant. Again, it seems obvious to me, but I would have died instantly if I lived before the modern world. I would have died because I'm useless. And so, like, having somebody say, I'm going forward, and then going sideways, you're like, oh, wait, we could have gone sideways all these millennia? And somebody's like, yeah, let's go sideways. And all of a sudden, you have more land, right? You have more space to sow crops, which produces more. They continue to innovate in terms of especially using animals and machinery as it became better, to make it easier on essentially the human body as well, to be able to plant more quickly and more effectively. And so as they continue to innovate, these innovations made farming better and produced better and essentially stronger crop yields. They also started to improve the infrastructure. Again, thinking about literally things like ports and roads and safety and carts. So when I say infrastructure, I literally mean those things that make moving food, moving materials quicker, more efficient, and cheaper. Again, I feel like this is my experience in LA, but it stinks when you're in LA and like your tire's gonna pop all the time because they don't fix potholes, right? Except I can go to Costco and they'll fill my tire up for free. In the early modern period, if you hit a pothole and it breaks your wheel, it's like, uh-oh, now I'm stuck in the middle of nowhere, I have no wheel. Where am I gonna get another wheel? Can I afford it? And so even just saying we have to have better paved, better maintained, quicker routes to major areas, hugely significant. Sorry, G, your hand went up, sorry. Makes it safer, cheaper, easier, better. Yeah, roads, ports, safety. It's always dangerous at this time, right? If you're out in the middle of nowhere, even on a road, you'll just get robbed. So making sure that trade routes are safe, things like that. So that's what I mean by infrastructure. These things that, again, they come across as somewhat like obvious in some ways, but were not so obvious, right, until you realized the issues going on. So making better paved roads where your wheel's not going to break, your horse isn't going to fall over and break its leg, right? That's like end of horse moment, right? So if you can have well-paved, safe, quick transportation, it's going to make life better for everybody in the early modern world. One of the things going on as well, it's, again, we will talk about this, I promise, it'll be next week finally, but is the fact that the colonies are growing significantly as well. The colonial world underneath all of this, again, can't be downplayed in terms of how it's impacting Europe directly. Again, in one way, as we saw with Louis XIV, that comes directly from wealth. People are getting richer off of industry, off of commercial ventures, off of products that are coming from the New World and Asian colonies in Europe. Again, that's also what helps produce these coffee houses. Right? Coffee is not a natural product to Europe, so it has to come from somewhere else. Once they realize that, so coffee used to come from the Middle East for Europeans, and once they realized it could be very well cultivated in the New World, right, it becomes one of the cash crops for Europe. Sugar, coming from modern-day India, they realize it can be used or cultivated significantly in the New World, and so they cultivate it en masse in the New World, and sugar again becomes a sort of luxury product for Europeans during this time. Now again, wealth, usually that means you can afford to live in healthier, more sanitary conditions, and in this world, sanitation is still humongously important, as they still don't have really the vaccines or the knowledge of how diseases spread, but they do recognize that good hygiene usually can eradicate some of the issues. But can you afford to live in a hygienic place? Can you afford to wash your clothes all the time? That's as wealth moves up, helps to mitigate some of those unhygienic practices of Europe. And then it turns out that lots of the crops that are natural to the New World are easier to grow and are abundant in calories. For instance, the potato. I'll talk about some of these when we talk about colonization. But some of you may have even grown up with in your background, the Irish potato famine, right? Is a big part of 19th century Irish experience. Potatoes are not natural or not indigenous to Ireland. They were brought to Europe, cultivated significantly, which then in the modern period resulted in a famine when they had some terrible crop diseases that spread throughout potatoes. But it turns out potatoes, cheap, easy, filled with nutrients. Corn, similar instance there as well. Cheap, easy, filled with nutrients. And so as you got crops that were introduced into the European diet that could help keep them strong and healthy, it resulted in longer lifespans as well, which that also leads to population growth. Finally, with all of this, one of the things that maybe got better, again associated with better hygienic practices, is that fewer plague outbreaks took place in the Enlightenment world. So that was almost like a natural inclination to them to say, wow, life is getting better. It's not that the plague went away. The plague is still happening for sure, but there's fewer plague outbreaks and of less intensity, we might say, in the Enlightenment world. Which made it seem like to them, of course, progress is being made. Right? We're not dying of the plague any longer like our ancestors who lived in the Dark Ages and always having to deal with the plague, and they thought God did it. We know God's not doing it. It must be down to our hygiene. Right? It must be down to our practices. And so the world just seemed to be getting better, even with there being fewer plague outbreaks than in the past. So things are starting to change, and it seems to be getting better. And this is what I mean is when they say hey, we are progressing, they have some pretty clear data points to point to. Life is getting better, people are getting wealthier, they're living longer, population's going up. Europe is getting wealthier, more diversity of crops and industries. And so besides just the great ideas they're coming up with, they're also literally progressing in society. One of the earliest things that happens, again, this will be connected probably in your Hume 3 class, is some industrial changes that begin. Again, up until this time, Europe was still very much in the trappings of the Middle Ages in terms of industry. You became an apprentice to become a blacksmith. You became a master blacksmith. You joined the blacksmith's guild, and you were the blacksmith for that area. So if somebody needed to come, they come directly to you, and you are the master of that industry. That's generally not how things work today. You buy a product, and it usually has about 700 different things it goes through before it gets to you on your doorstep from an Amazon drone, right? The first movements from that old medieval world into this sort of assembly line structure that we have today begins in the Enlightenment as well. And they refer to it, and scholars refer to it as the putting out system. essentially how do products come into the world, right? How do products come into the market? So again, in the past, let's say you wanted some clothes, you might have to go to an expert, right? A master tailor who might spin the wool, his or herself, sew the garments, dye it. Maybe you would go off to a dyer whose only job was to dye the product. It would get embroidered by the tailor, and then you would have this really well-crafted, right, hand-made product. But it might be done by one, maybe two people maximum. This system, the putting out system, is more like what we'll see in the Industrial Revolution, but the Industrial Revolution, again, that'll be for Hume 3, makes it really big to many different industries. Here we're kind of making it a little bit more, a little smaller. So what would happen is that in this world, merchants in the city, and here's London, so that's a depiction of London. Merchants in the city would purchase raw material. All right, so here's essentially the different stages, right? A merchant would buy, let's say, wool. Raw wool from somewhere up in England. And instead of doing what maybe in the past is that person would spin the wool his or herself, now that wool will be sent out to the countryside to these farmers. Now, I'll bring this up again in a second, but farming is literally according to the calendar. And so it used to be in the world that a farmer, right, he or she would sow their seeds, and then you have to wait for those seeds to grow. Right? It takes months and months. Of course, you're doing some things to ensure that the seed grows abundantly, but once you've sown your field, you're really just waiting. And so one of the things that the putting out system did is said, well, while you're waiting, why don't you produce some more material? And so they would take that raw wool and they would send it out to these rural workers who were kind of waiting for their crops to grow and say, hey, take this wool and you spin it out for me into a piece of cloth. And so then those farmers would take the wool and they would do the spinning themselves and produce a piece of cloth. Here I have the broader term of a textile, because this is not just for spinning wool, this is for all sorts of different products. So merchant buys the raw materials, sends it out to the farmer. The farmer takes that raw product and produces a textile, like a piece of cloth. That farmer is then paid for each piece of cloth that they produce. All right, so if you produce 100 pieces of cloth, let's say that's $1 per piece, so now you've made $100 that day. And then that product goes from there back to the city. And it becomes something that's sold, in London. So again, the Industrial Revolution will come in Hume 3, but one of the things about the Industrial Revolution is it takes jobs that used to be done by one person and makes them into a bunch of different steps. So instead of having a dress that's sewn by one master tailor, you have one person that does this, and another person that does that, and so you might just be doing this little tiny part. This putting out system is that first step, where now the merchant is sending some work out to this farmer, and then it goes down the assembly line to the next stage before it's then sold in a marketplace. Now, this actually began to change these economies out in the countryside. So one of the things that actually changes significantly in the Enlightenment is the rural economy, right? For farmers out in the middle of nowhere, their economy actually changes into more of an urban economy. Money has been in existence for thousands of years, well, let's say 2,000 years by this point. But farmers were still living like it was 5,000 BC. right? They were still living with, I have a goat, you have a chicken, what can we do? Right? Or you're a blacksmith, you're a carpenter, how can we make this work? Now, peasant farmers have money. So even farmers, essentially their wealth, I don't want to they're still peasant farmers, but even their wealth starts to go up because they don't have to get rid of, let's say, a goat to get a chicken anymore. They're not doing the bartering where it just ends up canceling themselves out. You can keep your goat and you can make money with raw materials being produced while you wait for your crops to grow. And so now all of a sudden, I don't know how you're expecting your job to go, but especially in America, there's like this problem that nobody's ever allowed to stop working. That your boss will always text you at any time in the night to tell you to get to work. Well, guess what? That begins here. Because now all those months you could take off in between sowing and reaping your seeds, right, as a farmer. Well, guess what? All those months that you were waiting, now you can do some work. And it's beneficial for them, right? It's bringing many communities out of poverty in different ways. It's actually producing a middle class, finally, in Europe. Up until now, there really has not been anything that's called a middle class, and we're kind of moving in that direction, where it's not just rich or abject poverty, but you can actually be somewhere in between those two things and have a better life that's cleaner, that's more diverse in terms of what you have and what you do, but you got to work for it. This also brought the two worlds of the farm and the city into interaction more often. Again, at this point, most people still live in the countryside as farmers. And they didn't really need to interact with anybody in the city. People in the city maybe relied on farms to bring food in, but an urban dweller also did not need, to interact with somebody out in the rural parts of Europe. But now they're interacting frequently because of these joint ventures between, product makers, merchants, and the people actually out there spinning the wool or making the actual textile. And so now the city and the countryside are becoming more intertwined. They used to be almost two very clear spheres, and now they're becoming more and more integrated. So again, even if you think about Enlightenment ideas, let's say a merchant who's just been at the coffee shop talking about Newton's theory of gravity, and then the next day that person's out at the farm saying, hey, here's all this wool, I need you to produce it. You might ask that farmer, like, hey, did you hear about Newton's theories on optics? Right? And the farmer before would be like, I don't even know what you said, right? What are you talking about? Does that have to do with, what is that? Like glasses? So all of a sudden, even ideas are spreading because now you have people in the city, sort of intellectual culture discussing these things with people who are out in the countryside as farmers who would never really interact with these types of ideas because their lives are hard and difficult and they can't get into the city. But now these interactions are becoming more and more frequent. So the world is getting more and more interconnected. Alongside that, one of the big things that came with this interaction is, again, what we have now, the beginnings of urbanization. During this time, urbanization, in case you don't know that word, urbanization is focused on the cities, as cities grow. During this time, again, population started to go up. And especially amongst the biggest cities, they became very big in the early modern period, in this Enlightenment world. Especially towns that were dedicated to industry. Again, just to make a connection, it would be like, right, Detroit is still associated with the American auto worker. It'd be essentially something like that in those early days, where the auto industry, because it was getting bigger, people flocked to Detroit and would have produced very quickly a very urbanized area that maybe wasn't before, has now become very urbanized. So like in the UK, a city now that's kind of like a second or third tier city, a place like Liverpool, where the Beatles are from, that became really big in the Enlightenment period because it was a place of urbanization. They had a dock there that could bring products back and forth easily over into Ireland and then down into continental Europe. And so people moved to Liverpool en masse because of these manufacturing centers that are there. And so it went from like a nice little port city to an urban, like a city, very quickly. By the end of the Enlightenment, right, around the year 1800, London finally hits 1 million people. Sorry, I forgot to press that next one. But Northwestern Europe, places like Amsterdam, again, London, Liverpool, Frankfurt in Germany, these places grew exponentially during this time. So it was really significant in the northwestern parts of Europe. Again, there's the city of London. By the year 1800, it had reached 1 million people, which is very significant for the early modern period. It took a long time. London at this point is 1,800 years old. So it took 1,800 years to get to 1 million, but it's finally reached that stage by the year 1800. And so cities begin to rapidly urbanize. And again, this also produces more wealth. There's a lot, again, an influx of wealth into Europe and into the cities. And so what we began to see as well during this time is, and this is where this term comes from, they would refer to it as a middling class. Middling, which you can just update to middle class. But again, this is what politicians still care about, right? You cannot go 1 minute in a presidential election in America without the candidate saying middle class, right? Within 1 minute. And they might say it 400 times, right, in their speech. Middle class, middle class, middle class, middle class. The middle class only begins in Europe, really, during the Enlightenment. We might say the 1700s is the beginning of the sort of European middle class. These are people that are not extravagantly wealthy, but now begin to have access to things that were only available to the extravagantly wealthy. Now it's becoming available in smaller portions. Everybody's not living in a castle by any means, but in smaller portions to more people. For instance, more people start to get educated during this time. Again, a lot of it has to do with that society, that sort of rational society that's underneath all of this. Right? Between universities, between academic societies and journals, you have to be able to read, right? To be able to read those journals, and as it became fashionable to do so, more people began to read, literacy rates go up, and so you have more education. In this period, the better the education, the more likely you are to succeed in society. You also start to see, again, and we'll talk about this with colonization as well, but essentially the things that, again, we take for granted, which is the idea that if you have excess income, you can begin to invest that income into some sort of industry, some sort of enterprise. And so the middling class, they didn't have tons of money, right? People have been investing if they were super rich for a long time, but now the middle class has just a little bit extra sort of disposable income that they too can put into investments. They too can invest in colonial ventures and actually get some money back for the wealth that's being produced in the colonies. Again, something that was only available to the uber rich before has now become more available to the everyday person. You start to see fashions growing throughout Europe. Again, the middle class clearly is able to purchase fancier clothing in particular. Again, you can make a one-to-one correlation to things like more embroidery is more expensive. And so when you see middle-class households with not just a plain cloak, but a cloak that might just have a little bit of artistic sort of flair to it, that means they could afford something more substantial, right? Something more fashionable, more elegant, making them look like they're in the upper classes now than before, when you might just have a clear, oh, that guy's very rich, you can see, and then you have a bunch of peasants in undyed wool, right? Just brown wool or something. It's like, oh, peasant. You see somebody with blue embroidered cloak, you're like, rich. Now those two things are getting closer to each other. With more income, more leisure time, you can essentially produce a better, more luxurious life, we might say. And then one of the things that we start to see as well, again, things that seem like take for granted nowadays, but even the fact that people could actually buy furniture that itself as well was a little bit more artistic. Right? You can again think about what we now call quote unquote antique furniture, right? Antique furniture, even though it's only like 100 years old, we're like, yeah, it's antique. Made from solid wood, and it's got a little bit of embroidery to it. That used to be just for the realm of the uber rich in European society. But now we start to see similar types of bed frames, of dressers, of mirrors, again, curtains even, right, around their beds that are embroidered. Just sort of small things like that where you realize, wow, people had more disposable income, but they don't look like they're earls and dukes and barons and kings and queens. These look like just everyday people who are able to afford these things that used to be strict luxuries to the rich. And now we're starting to see that proliferate in the middling class. And so society seems to be kind of going upwards in terms of quality of life in Europe. And again, these are some of the things that people are saying to themselves, man, things are getting better. Things are substantially growing in a positive way in Europe. Any questions so far? Things like beds that have large, like frames and posts, dressers, honestly, things that you and I have even today, but now are just like really well made and have some flares to them, whether it's sort of rosette designs, things like that look like roses or other types of unique designs. Mirrors. Mirror is actually a complicated product in the early modern period. So if you have a nicely embroidered mirror that was big and heavy, things like that. So it's really kind of just some of those basics, right? Going from I used to live in a hovel somewhere, right, and that was made of straw and mud, and now I live in a house and it has like a bed and a dresser, and I still have some money to invest in a colonial enterprise. And I'm not dying of the plague, and life just seems to be getting better. All right, let's take our break and we'll come back at 1 o'clock even. It didn't really become a city until the 20th century, but I don't know if you've noticed, but we're a horribly, poorly planned city, not ready for the influx of people that came. We have like a subway that has like 2 stops. Our streets are too small. We can't build enough, housing for the people that live here, and we're dumping stuff into the ocean left and right. We're not ready for having 6 million people, and we're still not, even though we're 100 years old, or obviously older than that, but 100 years as a city, we're still not ready for the amount of people that live in this city. As you can imagine, wind back the clock to the 1700s, and one of the big issues with urbanization is infrastructure can never really keep up with what's happening. And so, again, a lot of the worst instances of urbanization are going to be saved for if your professor talks about it in Cube 3. But at this stage, you're starting to get some of the very difficult aspects of a lot of people moving into a city all at once that's not prepared for that amount of people to show up. The biggest issue at this point is the continued growth of, again, what scholars refer to simply as the urban poor. Right? This is very different than the rural peasants, right, who live out in the countryside. Very different phenomenon because rural peasants who live in the countryside, they may still have their farm, right? They may have their house. They're just subsisting and they can't make a lot of money. The urban poor don't have any land, aren't farming, have no houses, and are living on the streets or living in horrible conditions in a rapidly expanding location. And so they can't really even subsist on what they're making right off the land like the peasants out in the countryside can do. And so you start to hear stories and experience in the imagery from the time of people living in the worst possible conditions in these massive industrializing urban centers. People that cannot look after themselves, have no place to live, are not making any income, and again are living in the streets. And again, these streets are not particularly well paved, not particularly clean. They might still be filled with horses and all the accoutrements that come with horses spread throughout the streets. Very poor sanitary conditions in a world that doesn't have particularly good sanitary conditions. And so you have the worst examples of that, and people moving to the cities thinking this is a place that they can get a job, right? Enter into an industry, perhaps gain some wealth, those things not working out. And so then you have the growth of people that may have had work in different professions before, now living on the streets in places like London and Amsterdam, in Liverpool, again in Frankfurt. And one of the hardest things about this, oh sorry, G, was your hand up or no? Yeah.
Asking, so the reason why they couldn't get jobs is because there wasn't enough jobs.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. It's similar to now. I've had lots of friends that moved off to New York City to be rich and famous, and then moved back to Reading real quick after that because they think of something about the way that New York or a city works, and it turns out it's very difficult there as well. Right? It's very competitive. Same thing happening at this point. It's competitive. Markets or like industries are falling out, right? You think you're going to make it rich, and the boat gets sunk in the middle of the Atlantic, and now all of the stuff that you invested in is gone. You've lost all of your money in this era, right? And so you have extreme competition, and so you have people moving to the urban centers thinking that something's going to happen, and the opposite happens, and they just end up landless, houseless, jobless, living on the streets in a place that cannot, like there's no infrastructure for welfare benefits, healthcare benefits. There is no income that's going to be coming from the government that may help to support somebody as they look for, like all those things that you and I now rely on. If I were to lose my job, I wouldn't just fall into poverty all of a sudden. That does not exist in this world. Yeah. Good question. And to make matters even grosser, this place is not ready for the amount of garbage and human garbage that is going to be produced in these massively expanding urban centers. Again, some of these places are just beginning to see sewage systems develop, but most houses at this point still don't have like a flushing toilet. Right, so you're kind of still living in between the old world and the new world at this point. Yes, it's urbanized, but you may not have a toilet that you can just flush and it goes out to the sea or to the river. And so you're still essentially taking care of your human matter out in the streets. In some cities that do have that, they're just dumping that stuff into their local river, right? So if you live in London during this time, right, the River Thames goes right through London, and people are just dumping their waste into the river, you'll never guess, but the river becomes like unlivable at that point. I don't know if any of you followed the Olympics from this last summer, but the Seine, the river that goes through Paris, was just barely made livable so that people could swim in it. And I think some of them still got a little sick swimming in the Seine. So, yeah, so if you go to Paris, do not get in the Seine River. It looks very nice. You will get dysentery or something. So do not do that. Even today, in the middle of Paris, do not go anywhere near the Seine River with your mouth open. Again, they worked for like years testing this to get people, and they just barely made it to that stage. Right? And this is with extreme advanced, technology in terms of filtration, right, and purification. Not in this world. A world in which garbage is piling up on the streets, and again, they don't recognize, or they don't quite understand yet, that that's how disease spreads. Especially garbage brings in the rats. Rats carry the fleas. Fleas carry the plague, right? And so we don't have, again, the huge outbreaks of the plague like we saw at the beginning of our class, but this still leads to the disease spreading more rapidly in urban areas than it would in other parts of the world. And then again, you're dumping all of that into the river, which you may be using for all sorts of different reasons. Again, in this period, people are not washing their clothes very often, and they're not really changing clothes very often. And in the urban world, you can just imagine that the smells in the city would have been about as awful as you could get. And so it might be a place where you think you're going to be able to make it rich and be able to join in on a great venture or to become a part of society and culture and thinking about these great ideas. But the minute you get there, you are confronted by the stench of the city pretty much immediately. And it got worse as more and more people moved, and the infrastructure could not keep up with the amount of people moving in. Again, thankfully, these city planners realized that this is an issue, and so over the course, especially of the late 17th and early 1800s, they begin to essentially refashion their cities to make room for the amount of people that are moving in. London, again, for instance, used to have a bunch of different rivers that ran through it, but in the age of industrialization, like here in LA, they started taking those rivers and essentially moving them underground. So now you can't even see most of the rivers in London, and they all just filter out through the sewers into the Thames. I don't know if you've seen the gorgeous LA River. Have you ever seen the gorgeous LA River? Beautiful. Go watch the movie Grease. And at the end of Grease, when they have the car chase in this big concrete thing, that's the LA River. The beautiful, beautiful LA River, which is really just a concrete ditch that runs through the middle of our city. It shouldn't be that way. But again, due to urbanization, things like that have had to adapt as more and more humans moved in. And they can't get ahead of it at this point. They cannot get ahead of it, right? Until the technology begins to catch up, the wealth continues to catch up. And then again, across the 19th century, urban centers become more modern. But again, I'll leave that for human history. So it's not all good. The urban centers are disgusting. For most people, you might be able to make it rich, but you're going to live in squalor. You're going to live in a place that's filled with human feces and trash and rivers that are polluted to be unlivable. But at least you'll make it rich, right? So you think. Again, societies did develop, though. Again, I don't want to make it seem like all bad in urbanization. So coming back to this idea of manufacturing centers, right? This idea like a place like Liverpool is growing because it is a place of manufacturing and a place of trade. You did start to see the growth of even some movement amongst peoples during this time. So one of the things that became more common, and again, I don't know if we necessarily do this nowadays, maybe the closest would be if you do an internship somewhere. But oftentimes in these manufacturing centers, you would actually get people who were apprentices or what are called journeymen, who would come into a manufacturing center and actually live and learn under the experts of that particular area, right? So again, if you were in a place like Liverpool, you might come in if you're from France, and again, you have the money for this, if you're coming from Paris, you might go to Liverpool and learn from masters there in your trade, and then take what you learned back to your area and begin to implement some of those changes in Paris, something along those lines. Again, somewhat like an internship, you might get paid for this, but this idea that you're going to go and you're going to learn from a master in one of these great manufacturing centers. In many ways, that's how the word journeyman in particular kind of morphed at this time. You can literally think of somebody going on a journey, right? You have a person coming from another area who's journeyed to your area to learn before he journeys, and is mostly men, journeys back to his area. And so these manufacturing centers also had a lot of influx of people coming in and out in order to learn and to take those skills back to their part of Europe. Many scholars argue that all of this put together produces a sub-theme, we might say, or a sub-movement within the Enlightenment, and that's called the Commercial Revolution. Again, you and I are the fruition of the Commercial Revolution. This idea that commerce has developed so substantially that, of course, there's the traditional markets that have always been there. There's always been food markets. There's always been, livestock markets. There's always been fishermen who sell their fish. There's always been textile markets. But now it seems like there's a market for everything in Europe. Things coming from all throughout the world that people can actually purchase, can talk about. Again, especially with the middling class being able to get in on that, now it's expanded even more. Again, just think about what's happening in our own world, where you have obviously Amazon, where you can get anything, right, instantly. And then you have, what's that other one that the Chinese developed? Is it called Temu? I've never used it. Is that what it's called? Yeah. So now you have a competitor. And then Amazon came up with their own version of that on the app. I don't know if you saw that. It's like, get rid of that, right? But everything is built so that what you need, you can get. No matter who you are, really, right? You can essentially buy anything or a copycat of anything and make it look like you have that thing, right? Again, the seeds of that are beginning here as there's more wealth in Europe, and therefore can be used to purchase more stuff. In other words, there's just simply a demand for luxury goods in a way that there has never been a demand for luxury goods. And I don't even mean like things that I would consider luxury right now, right? It's not like luxury in the sense of, people buying gold-plated stuff everywhere. I don't mean that level of luxury, just things that they literally was no possible way to purchase before. Even things that I take for granted, like a piece of furniture, that then you can hand that down to your children. Not possible to do before this influx of wealth. Houses for the middling class start to become more elaborate. Again, you can think about some of these great cities in the inner parts of these cities where you have houses that may be multi-tiered, but are really just for the middle class. Now they're in the middle of the city and are worth millions of dollars, and it's like that was a middle-class family's house at one point. Right? So they've gone from, again, living in like these straw and mud houses out in the middle of nowhere to now the middle-class people can have a wooden, multi-story, somewhat elaborate house in the middle of a city. But they're not considered like uber wealthy. And so that produces these continued markets where the middling classes buy up more and more things. Whether it's products or whether it's things like sugar, whether it's chocolate, or whether their clothes are now dyed. Again, this is very simple, but peasants could not dye their clothes. It was too expensive. So you knew you were a peasant because you had a wool shirt that was brown. Right? Now, maybe it's a little bit harder because the middling class can say, I also want a dyed cloak. And so now you have people wearing more colors out in the city. So it might have actually changed the way that the city looked. Like multiple colors instead of just like brown and then the rich people. It's like, oh, now everybody's got a few different colors going on in the middle of the city. That produces more demand, more desire. Industries continue to rise up during this time. Again, one of the things that we now inherit that really became popular is what we now consider, again, sort of service industries. Again, just think about that image. I should have brought it and put it on this slideshow, but that image of the coffee house as my title slide, right? Think about, again, people that we would now consider to be servers, right, or waiters, people working at these coffee shops that can now essentially make a wage working in a coffee shop. Something that would not have been considered really a legitimate or feasible, I should say. It would have been legitimate, but a feasible job before this sort of commercial revolution. But we also start to see some of the things that, again, were only relegated to the rich now become part of the life of the middle class. Like having essentially workers who might work in your home, like a maid. So a middle class person might be able to actually afford a maid who can help that family to take care of tasks around the household that they would have never been able to do in the Renaissance, in the Reformation period. But now with excess money, you have this whole essentially industry of people doing service work for the middle class. Again, this is a whole industry, obviously, in the modern world, right? The service industry. And it's beginning to explode at this point, where people are taking on jobs that are doing service for middling and upper class people because it's becoming a feasible job that provides wages that maybe sometimes they even live in with the family. So there's a mutual aspect to it. You live in here with us, we provide you food and a little bit of money that you can then spend on luxury goods because you already have your housing taken care of. So then you, even as a service person, could say, I'm going to go and I'm going to buy myself a piece of chocolate from the New World or something like that. And so all of a sudden, even lower classes are, again, kind of bubbling up a little bit as well. So again, if you could think about sort of the stereotypes of like 1800s life of sort of an English gentleman and lady out at walking in London, and maybe their babies back in a carriage with a servant or something. All that stuff is beginning at this point. Those people don't have to be wildly wealthy anymore to be able to hire somebody to work in their house, or people can go to work at coffee shops or as merchants in shops and to be able to make a wage that allows them to live in this new commercial revolution. So again, a lot of what you and I not only take for granted, but kind of exploit to the nth degree is beginning at this period. And again, it's going to come into play with colonialism as we discussed how products are moving throughout the world and how it's making things generally for Europeans cheaper. And how those industries are then growing and growing as colonization continues to grow as well. There does seem to be in this period an indication by people that it feels like things are changing. Again, they're not going around saying to themselves, man, it's so great to live in the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment's awesome. But they do feel like things are changing. Right? You can get it from the works being published, the letters that we can still read, that there seems to be the old world is kind of passing away and a new world is coming into being. And people could feel it, right, with generations that change. Industry is now beginning to take over, right? Things that have been taken for granted for hundreds of years now are changing very quickly. Whether it's farming, industry, urban centers, people moving out of the countryside and into cities, things are changing in a way that they can actually feel it. And you get that. And the word that they use is one that we still use today. And that is, they believed that they were living in a time of progress. this is where, again, you might start to see terminology that we also still use to today, like living in a progressive society. We are moving into an era that's better than the one that we came from. And they start to use that terminology. Things are literally progressing in a positive direction. Now again, is that correct across the board? No. Again, there's still people who are falling through the cracks. It's produced a growing urban core that have lots of difficulties still in life. People are still farming just to get by out in the countryside. In France, they're being taxed almost to death, and they're about to revolt against that. Wars are still taking place throughout Europe. Disease is still spreading. There are pretty much no functioning democracies yet at this point. But even some of the monarchs are starting to call themselves, or we give them this phrase, but monarchs who were absolutists start to lean into this thing that we call enlightened absolutism. Like, yes, they still oppress you and they're still in charge of everything and you have no say in that. But, they start to fund scientific ventures. They start to fund things like opera houses. They start to fund royal societies for science, mathematics. And so even the absolutists start to pull from this trend of progress and use it for their own needs. Because they can feel the trend happening amongst the everyday people. And so they start to take on to that too. And we call those people enlightened absolutists. They may still be dictators, but at least they read, the new philosophies. And I think that's where we'll end for today. So stick around if you have questions.